when they found them. So basically, you were told, go to an inspection center. Go to your nearest inspection center. You would go to your inspection center. A Japanese soldier would say, a military police officer would say, okay, show me your documents, show me your anything that tells me who you are. And they would then make a decision. Okay, either you're okay and you can go. They would put a stamp on, I think, on your head or your hand. I don't remember where they would put the stamp. They would put the stamp and you would be free to leave. What happens if you were not okay? If you were not okay, they would take you outside, they would put you in a truck, and they would say, here, you sit in the truck. They would wait till the truck was full, and then the truck would then drive out of the city, and it would go out to the far distant coast of Singapore. The men would then be taken out of the truck, they would be tied together by their legs, they would all be told to stand on the line, and then they were executed by the Japanese. Now, the Japanese called this daitenship, great inspection. The Chinese called it something else. They called it sitchin, which means purge by cleansing. So basically, ethnic cleansing is essentially what it was. How many people did the Japanese kill? Well, no one knows for sure. The Japanese themselves, the Japanese government at the time, acknowledged that they killed about 5,000 people. However, after the Second World War, a Japanese commander signed an affidavit where he said, actually, officially we wanted to kill 50,000. We actually killed about 25,000. So that's what he said. If you talk to the Chinese community in Singapore, they will tell you 50,000. So no one knows for sure exactly how many were killed, but it was between 5,000 and 50,000. In the 1960s, this is what you're looking at here. In the 1960s, the Singapore Chinese Chamber of Commerce said, okay, we're going to set up a commission. We know that there are mass graves around Singapore. We're going to set up a commission, and what we're going to do is we're going to go and try to find the mass graves. They hired a few men to go with shovels and dig up the graves. They started to find the graves, and they found the bodies, and they found the bones. There were just bones left. This was 20 years later. They found the bones, they took the bones, they put the bones in all these big containers, and today, and you can't see it, but if you go just down the road from here, there is a Second World War memorial, and under the Second World War memorial, all the bones that they recovered from the mass graves are there. What's this? So what this is when they were digging the mass graves, looking for the bones, they also found all of these things. So all of these things that you're looking at, these were the possessions that the Chinese men had when they were executed by the Japanese. And what it tells you was, a lot of the Chinese men who were executed, they didn't know what was going to happen to them. They were just told, come here and be inspected. They just went. They had, all kinds of stuff. There was people with their pipes. They had their pocket watches, they had their wallets, you name it, all kinds of stuff. You'll find all keys, everything. There was all kinds of stuff on them. It's not like they were prisoners of war. They just went out one afternoon to see what they were asked to do, and a few hours later, they were basically executed. It's a very sad part of the tour. We're not going to talk too much more about this, but basically that was the story of the Sukchin massacre, and it's a big part of why the Second World War is such a sensitive topic, even today still, right, for a lot of people in Singapore. Discussion of the Second World War is such a sensitive topic for many people. Okay, so 1945, the Japanese surrendered, and Singapore started to get ready for independence. So we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about Singapore's next steps.
No, you have to. It's not all. It's just part of it.
Okay.
Just one tool.
So the Japanese left in 1945, and the British came back. However, it was not like it was before. The Chinese people in Singapore went, hey, wait a minute, hold on. You couldn't defend us against the Japanese. Why do we want you back? So there was not a lot of the British were not very popular when they came back. Also, the world was changing. What was happening in the world? In the late 1940s, of course, Europe was being rebuilt with the Marshall Plan. Communism was starting to grow. The Soviet Union had been communist for a while, but they were now very communist at that point. They were growing their influence in Eastern Europe. And the other thing was the British colonial empire was starting to fall. So Britain had, remember throughout the 18th century, Britain was the preeminent world power. As you moved into the 20th century, the United States, of course, became the preeminent world power, and the UK started to lose their colonies. Malaysia became independent in 1957. India became independent in 1947. 47, yeah. So Britain was starting to lose their colonies. When was Singapore going to gain its independence? Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to meet three men. We talked about Stamford Raffles earlier. One of these three men is the second most, or if not maybe the most famous man in Singapore's history. So we're going to meet three men who basically had a big role to play in helping Singapore get its independence. The first man is this man, David Marshall. So, in the 1955, the UK said to Singapore, okay, you can have self-government. You're still a British colony, but we will let you run your own affairs. You can have an election, and you can vote for your own self-government. This man, David Marshall, was elected the first Chief Minister of Singapore. It was the first time in Singapore's history, in 1955, that a local person was elected to run Singapore's local affairs. Now, David Marshall said, okay, great, I'm the Chief Minister. However, we only have limited self-government. We're not independent, and we don't have full self-government. I want more control. I want local people in Singapore to be able to control our own affairs. So he organized a trip for Singapore politicians to go to London and to negotiate with the British to get more freedom. However, the British said, well, wait a minute. They looked at what was going on in Singapore and they said, wait, when we look at Singapore now, we can see that there's a lot of poverty. We can see that there's a lot of economic disruption. We can see that there's a lot of riots. And you can see, if you see behind you there, you'll see, people waving flags. There was a lot of political unrest in Singapore. There were a lot of riots as well. And the British said, you guys are not able to control your own country. Why would we give you more control? So David Marshall said, okay, the talks have failed. He came back to Singapore and he resigned. He was then replaced by this man over here, Lim Yew Hock. Now, Lim Yew Hock was a little bit different to David Marshall. He was from the same party as David Marshall, but he came from a trade unionist background. Before he became a politician, he was a trade unionist. And so he realized the reason the talks with the British failed is because the local government were not doing enough to control security in Singapore. So Lim Yew Hock basically started to change all of that. When there were riots, he would arrest people and he would hold them in prison as long as he could. He used tear gas to break up the riots. The British said, hey, yeah, this guy's pretty good. We like this guy. So when he went back to London to have more negotiations with the British said, yes, we like the changes you have made. We will give you full self-government. So they had to have an election. And the election was in 1959. And the idea was, with this new election, the man who was elected, or the party who was elected, the head of that party will be the Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister of Singapore. And you can see him over there. Does anyone know who the first Prime Minister of Singapore was?
Lee Kuan Yew.
Say that again.
Lee Kuan Yew.
Lee Kuan Yew, very good, very good. Let me ask you a question. Do you think Lee Kuan Yew or Stamford Raffles is more famous in Singapore's history?
Sorry, Lee
What
Kuan
do you
Yew.
think is more famous in Singapore, more significant in Singapore's history? Stamford Raffles or
This guy, of course.
All right, so there you have your answer. Who is the most important person in Singapore's history? Maybe Stamford Raffles might be number two. A lot of people will tell you that this man is number one, Lee Kuan Yew. So the election was in 1959. Singapore was still not independent, but for now, Singapore could completely run all of its own affairs. This man, Lee Kuan Yew, was elected. Now, Lee Kuan Yew, basically, he had been born in Singapore, grew up in Singapore, but he was educated in Europe. He was trained in the legal profession, and he was an English-speaking Singaporean lawyer who went and studied law in the UK. The problem was, when you're an English-educated lawyer in a country like Singapore, where the majority of the people spoke Chinese, how are you going to communicate with the people? How are you going to connect with the people? So one of the things Lee Kuan Yew was very famous for, one of the things he was very good at, was his party, the People's Action Party, which is still the governing party in Singapore today. was very good at bringing in other people, and basically merging, uniting people together, and that's how he became the prime minister. So what will, yeah,
Has this party been in control since independence started?
ever since 1959. So independence came, we'll talk about that now, independence came in 1965, but the People's Action Party was first elected to power with Lee Kuan Yew as prime minister in 1959. Okay, we'll move on, and we're going to talk next about how Singapore became independent.
Provided other things are equal. I mean, one heavyweight versus another
We'll stay here, I think. What we'll do, we'll cover it very quickly. So basically, the very quick story about how Singapore became independent was the British, the Singaporeans, the Malays, Singapore was just a small island. It had no natural resources. How could it become independent on its own? And the answer was it probably couldn't become independent on its own. It would have to be merged with Malaysia. However, Malaysia became independent in 1957, and the new Prime Minister of Malaysia was not very comfortable about having Singapore join the Federation of Malaysia. There were two reasons. One, he knew that communism was a threat in Singapore. And Singapore had a lot of social riots. The socialists, the communists, they were becoming a powerful force. They were fighting with Lee Kuan Yew. So that was problem number one. Problem number two was he was worried about the ethnic majority in Singapore. So Malaysia, to this day still, is a predominantly Malay ethnic country. Singapore, then, as it is now, is a predominantly Chinese country. Now these days, Malaysia's population is about 40 million, I think Singapore's is about 5.5 million. Back in those days, actually, they were about the same. So what the Prime Minister of Malaysia knew was if we let Singapore in, the Chinese majority population in Singapore will become the majority of Malaysia. And he realized the Malays would lose their ethnic majority. So he didn't agree with that. However, he also knew that if he didn't do something to help Singapore, Singapore could become a communist country. And he was worried about that. He used to refer to it as his own Cuba in his backyard. The United States had to worry about Cuba. He had to worry about Singapore. So that's what he was worried about. So in 1961, I think, he agreed. He said, fine, we will let Singapore join the Federation of Malaysia. So in 1963, they had a referendum. They agreed. They said, yes, Singapore will join the Federation of Malaysia. Singapore left the British and became part of Malaysia. However, it wasn't an equal member of the Malay Federation. What actually happened was Singapore joined the Federation of Malaysia, but it was a self-governing group within Malaysia. It wasn't officially it was part of Malaysia, but it wasn't one of the regular Malay states. Malaysia is made up of 9 states altogether. And Singapore was supposed to become state number 10, but that didn't happen. Singapore basically just stayed semi-independent within Malaysia. So in 1963, they merged, and they stayed in the Federation of Malaysia for 2 years. And then in 1965, they came out, and Singapore became independent. The video that you can see over there is the video that was recorded in August 1965, when Lee Kuan Yew, that's the man we talked about just a minute ago, Lee Kuan Yew went on television and he announced that Singapore would no longer be part of the Federation of Malaysia. Why? Basically because when Singapore joined the Federation of Malaysia, there were a lot of riots, different types of riots. We had riots in the 50s, but in the 50s they were economic riots. In the 60s they were ethnic riots. It was Chinese fighting Malays. That was problem number one. Problem number two was the government in Singapore had lots and lots of disagreements with the government in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. They just couldn't agree on anything. And so it became very clear, after about a year, it became very clear that Singapore and Malaysia could not coexist. And so they made the decision that they would leave the Federation of Malaysia. However, you know when most countries get independence, it's like a moment of celebration. They celebrate. We're really happy we got independence. In Singapore, it wasn't celebration. And what you can see, and I think you're about to see it on the screen now in just a few seconds, his moment of anguish, because he went on television and he cried. He cried because he was uncertain about Singapore's future. Singapore was independent, But he didn't have a plan. He didn't know, they weren't expecting Singapore to become an independent nation. And so this is a very famous video clip. You can also find it on YouTube if you want to look for it when you go home as well. It's a very famous video clip. It was a press conference that was recorded in 1965, and it was Lee Kuan Yew announcing to the people, and you can see he's getting emotional now, announcing to the people that Singapore will leave the Federation of Malaysia and become an independent nation. What he actually talks about next, when he stops crying and they give him a few minutes to compose himself, he comes back again, and then he starts to talk about, look, nobody worry. You don't need to worry. I'm the Prime Minister. It's my job. I will worry, and we will find a plan. We will make a plan for the future. And that was the story of how Singapore became independent. So we'll move on, because we're getting close to the end now, and what we'll do is we'll talk just a little bit about what life was like after independence, and how Singapore went from this moment of anguish to the country that you see today. So, welcome to the factory floor. How did Singapore become the country it is today? Well, left Malaysia in 1965 and became an independent nation. What happened then? Well, when you become an independent nation, you have to find a way to run your own affairs. You have to fuel your own economy, right? So what did they do? Well, the problem was, today, Singapore's population is about 5 million, 5.5 million.
Right.
And the population, as we know now, is Singapore's population is falling. There's not, people in Singapore are not having babies anymore, so the population is falling. So that's why foreigners come in. Back in those days, it was very different. The population was about 1.5 to 2 million, but it was growing very quickly. Women were just having babies all the time. The problem was, every baby that was born in Singapore was born into poverty. And so they had to find a way to start injecting the economy to get the economy moving. So what did they do? Well, they said, look, start small, build little factories and make little things that don't require skills. Make things like candles and mosquito nets, mosquito coils, those kind of things like that. What it does is it gets people back to work, and then people start earning money that way. You get people back into the workforce that way. That was step number one. Step number two was, well, wait a minute. We have a growing population. We have lots of people. What can we do? Well, if we invite foreign companies to come into Singapore, we can give them tax breaks. We'll say to them, look, you don't have to pay any tax when you come here, but we want you to train our people. And that's what happened. Foreign companies came in, and they started to make these kind of products. You have televisions, you have radios, you have irons, things like that. These were the electrical products that they started to make. And so that was the plan. Get the foreign companies to come in, give them lots of land out in Jurong. I don't know if any of you have seen Jurong. It's in the west of Singapore. They set up factories in Jurong, and they said to the foreign companies, don't pay any taxes. You come, you make your products, you train, and then obviously our people will earn more money, our people will get educated. That's exactly what happened. Then from there they moved on and they moved into services like they do now. That was the story of how Singapore basically rebuilt its economy. They had to do it. Remember, it wasn't just that they became independent from Malaysia. They also had the British military base. The British decided to pull out of their military base in the 1960s. The military base accounted for 20% of Singapore's GDP. Accounted for 20% of Singapore's GDP. So it was actually important that once the British pulled out, that they had an economic plan, and that's where this came from. Okay, we're going to wrap up. We're going to move around the corner, and we'll just basically bring our tour to a conclusion there. Follow me.
Nói chung là vậy là
Cái bảo như anh không có tỉnh nào.
sôi cảm ơn. Cái bằng.
You should take photos of it.
We'll do after with
The
this.
gardens in a city. This is an actual depiction of what Singapore looks like today. You probably recognize it. Trees everywhere, birds singing, you can hear the birds. And these are, I think this is Bishan. Bishan is one of the suburbs kind of in the central area of Singapore. Essentially, where you're standing now is you're standing in a garden in a city. On our tour today, what we did is we started out at the yes, you can. Please join me. We started out at the very start, 700 years ago, and we talked about basically the arrival of the colonial powers before the colonial powers in Singapore. We then moved on. We talked about the arrival of the British, and what happened was the British and how they ran the economy in Singapore. Then we moved on after that. We talked about the Second World War, the arrival of the Japanese, the impact on the local Chinese community. And then we moved on to then talk about basically the political journey, how Singapore went from self-governing to independence and then started to build its economy. And we've now arrived where you are now. You've walked through 700 years of history. You've seen the dramatic changes in Singapore. Remember when we first walked into the Singapore History Gallery just over an hour ago? It didn't look like this. It looked very, very different. This is what Singapore looks like now. And so you get a sense, you get an idea of the footprints, the kind of things that have happened here on the island of Singapore over the last 700 years. That brings us to the end of our tour today. If you're interested in learning more about any particular aspect of history, downstairs there's a gallery on World War II dislocations. So if you're interested, learning more about World War II, you can go and take a look at that. If you want to learn more about Singapore post-independence in the 60s and 70s and 80s, upstairs there's some galleries that will tell you more about that. And if you want to learn about Singapore in the 1920s, there's a gallery upstairs to learn about that too. That's it. Thanks for your time this
Thank
morning.
you so much.
Thank
You're
you.
Thank you.
fantastic. Thank
Okay.
you.
See you
I have
guys.
one question.
Yeah, sure.
What is the oldest archaeological site there in